Hello everybody. I would really like to title this particular video Bathsheba's Secret. Now everybody really knows the story of Bathsheba. They really truly know that King David was an incredible king. He was probably a really hunky guy. He was married to a few women and he was the king. And he had done incredible military feats and was a hero and all kinds of different things. A real man after God's own heart. And one day he was out looking out of his palace and he sees a beautiful woman taking a bath. And even though King David really could have had any woman in Israel who was any age and he could have just really had his pick of women, there was something about that particular woman that caused him to ignore the fact that she was married to a faithful and loyal soldier. And he basically had her fetched for him, and he ended up committing adultery with her. And then when she became pregnant, he tried to cover it up by having her husband Uriah killed. So this is a very tragic story on many different levels, and I think that there are levels to this story that has never been really fully explored or really understood, and there's lots of mystery. And I really, really, truly believe that when we see what God did for Bathsheba, we can see that it wasn't just her giving into a moment of lust, but this particular thing that happened with her, with King David, was actually a deep betrayal and actually an incredible robbery. That something really precious was stolen from her. Because even though God took that initial baby home to be with him up in heaven, she was eventually given the crowned prince, the future king of England, in Solomon, but not just a future king. She was also given a son. And I don't mean just that his gender was a boy. I mean that incredibly coveted place that we're all secretly searching for and that we would all grab a hold of to pretty much any extent. And Solomon was born a son. So we see that there was something that happened in that particular exchange between Bathsheba and David that was gross sin on King David's part, and a real tragedy for Bathsheba. So I would really like to explore that in this particular video. When the prophet Nathan exposed King David on his sin, he didn't just say, "Hey, I know what you did. You were really bad." No, he gave King David a story that was supposed to really show him what it was that he had done. And King David, when he heard the story that really was about him, he didn't really realize it was about him, but he was so offended and so grossed out by what the man in the story had done that he condemned him to death. But God was merciful on him and didn't actually go through with the judgment that King David had judged on himself. But still, it really showed that it was a very grievous sin, including for King David. So when we look at the story that Nathan gave to David, we can really truly see that there are some very interesting details. One of them is that David is compared to an incredibly wealthy man who has a tremendous flock, lots and lots and lots and lots of flocks. And that he wanted to sacrifice one of these animals for something. But instead of going and grabbing one of his own, he actually saw his poor neighbor who had one beloved lamb that would fall asleep on his breast every single night, and that the wealthy man decided to actually sacrifice that little lamb. So this story is very intriguing because somehow the prophet Nathan was associating what had happened with Bathsheba with death. Not just the death of Uriah, her husband, but her death. And it's also very interesting to note that Bathsheba was so dearly loved by her own husband that she was the little lamb that was asleep on his breast. She was there all the time. And that you could just see a deeply loving, passionate relationship between the two of them. And so the fact that this wealthy man would be so careless with somebody else's precious, favored lamb is really telling of the coldness and the callousness in King David's heart. So what does all of that mean? I'm not entirely sure, to be completely honest with you. But what I really believe is that somehow the nurture and the care that Uriah was showing his wife was actually causing her to shine in such a beautiful way. He didn't have 10 wives. Uriah had Bathsheba, and he seemed to favor her and take care of her and to nurture her. And that seemed to be what was making her more and more beautiful. And I actually really suspect that she herself was on the way to sonship. And not only would her sonship have meant her own sonship and her own being able to experience that incredible place in God and that incredible favor of God, but it would have also propelled her husband into that position. And a priest is, and a son is always higher than a king. Sonship is considered a kind of priesthood. So, when we see this particular action, that David particularly picked this particular woman in this particular way, you could say that not only was he trying to steal what was Bathsheba's and Uriah's, he was taking her away from a place of favor and a place of single-hearted devotion. But he was also, he was doing a power play. He was trying to keep the power in his own hands, because sonship is a place of power as well as favor. So it wasn't just that King David was really eyeballing a woman. He was seeing treasure that she had because of the love and devotion of her husband. And he was basically knocking it out and taking it down. Also, too, King David himself had multiple wives. None of them had his single-hearted devotion and attention. None of them probably shone as beautifully as Bathsheba did. And so there's all kinds of problems with this particular story. So it happened as it happened, and God still loved Bathsheba so very much and loved King David as well. Even though King David, he didn't suffer, he might not have died himself, but he lost his children because of what he had done. And he lost Absalom, and he also lost his first crowned prince, who had raped his sister Tamar, probably with the same intention as King David did by taking Bathsheba. And that particular sin has haunted the house of David even to this day. And so we see something very, very ugly in the heart of the king and the heart of man. So what do I mean by all this? Well, of course a king was really told by God, and God can forgive so much, so it's not that King David was necessarily wrong for taking so many wives. But by taking so many wives, King David had cheated himself of that single devoted attention that would have built one of his wives up to sonship, which would have propelled him to sonship, because a couple goes together because they're one single person. So if they, if you are able to love your spouse, whether it's your wife or your husband, that propels you closer and closer and closer to sonship. Whereas if you're like King David, bless his heart, he was a great man. I don't mean to slander him, but he had multiple wives. He didn't give his single-hearted devotion to any of them. his focus was mostly on war and on making it to kingship and politics and battle and so on and so forth. He wasn't thinking about the relationships that he had or the women that he had. He had some pretty darn special women that if he had focused on, say, for example, Abigail, who showed tremendous faith, we don't really know what would have happened there if King David had just focused on what he had and tried to build up what he had. Instead, he tried to steal what another man's was, and another man who was bravely devoted to this little lamb, Bathsheba. So, how do I think that this matters for today? Well, as I said, I really believe that in the kingdom of God, you have tremendous power plays, just like you would in any worldly kingdom. What King David did was a power play. It wasn't just lust. It wasn't just a desire for sex. He was trying to make sure that nobody reached a higher, more powerful position in God's kingdom than himself. And he used his position as king in order to steal it from a couple in his kingdom. But this is kind of a warning to men in general, because if you have a wife, if you love yourself, if you're really truly wanting to come closer to God, you take the wife that you have, and God can do all kinds of weird little things. Like sometimes there are people in our lives that's like a husband or a wife. You could really, any woman that you would consider to be your own, and you would have to really understand that as good as she looks reflects on you as the man in her life, and that your own feelings of love for yourself will be seen on her. If she is a woman who's just completely smashed to pieces with self-hatred and feels terrible and feels unloved, that is an ultimate reflection of who you are as a man. And if your wife is beautiful and she's shining and she feels good about herself, it is because you are doing a wonderful job as a husband. And a husband and a wife in a perfect world will really do that for each other. Sometimes men try to sabotage the woman's sonship process, and in so doing he sabotages himself. But sometimes you also have wives who see her husband basically going towards God and trying to reach sonship, and she will really try to knock him down and take him out as well. So this isn't just a masculine problem. Women also do this as well. And that is, God can fix anything. He fixed everything with Bathsheba and King David, and I don't know how Bathsheba feels about it to this day, but ultimately she ended up going into this very special, all the promises that belonged to King David, she was able to grab a hold of, and eventually her line produced Messiah. So maybe it still ultimately all worked out through this redemption, but it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. So I really truly believe that this is key. This is really key to all those people who really want sonship. And unfortunately, most of people who are really truly striving for sonship, they end up knocking people out, and especially they end up knocking out the very people who are trying to help them get there. And that ultimately my hope, my real true sincere desire isn't just that people who are connected to me will somehow be underneath me. There's a lot of power plays even in the kingdom of God for people to grab a hold of each other. My ultimate sign of my success will be everybody empowered and into a place of sonship, and that's really my desire. So, and that is really in losing our ambitions and really truly loving and building the people up around us.